Continuing the Polemics of Infant Baptism by B.B. Warfield, a page or two further on in Dr. Strong's argument trying to make a systematic theology against infant baptism, page 534. And this is found on Polemics of Infant Baptism by B.B. Warfield, page 319. Strong takes up the question of infant baptism ex professo. This he rejects and reprehends, quote, and that for the following reasons. First, that infant baptism is without warrant, either expressed or implied in the Scripture. Infant baptism is expressly contradicted by scriptural teaching. The rise of infant baptism in the history of the Church is due to sacramental conceptions of Christianity, so that all arguments in its favor from the writings of the first 3 centuries are equal arguments for baptismal regeneration. The reasoning by which it is supported is unscriptural, unsound, and dangerous in its tendency. Lack of agreement among Paedo-Baptists as to the warrant for infant baptism and as the relation of baptized infants to the Church together with the manifest decline of the practice itself are arguments against it. The evil effects of infant baptism are a strong argument against it. Here is quite a list of arguments. We must look at the items one by one. First, when we asked after a direct scriptural warrant for infant baptism in the sense which Dr. Strong had in mind, in the first of these arguments, we of course have the New Testament in view, seeing that it is only in the new dispensation that this rite has been ordained. In this sense of the words, we may admit his first declaration that there is no express command that infants should be baptized, and with it also his second, that there is in Scripture no clear example of the baptism of infants, i.e., if we understand by this that there are no express record reciting in so many words that infants were baptized, then he adds to these. However, a third contention that the, quote, passages held to imply infant baptism contain, when fairly interpreted, no reference to such a practice, end quote, we begin to recalcitrate. If it were only asserted that these passages contain no such stringent proof that infants were baptized as would satisfy us on the point in the absence of other evidence, we might yield this point also, but it is too much to ask us to believe that they contain, quote, no reference to the practice, end quote, if fairly interpreted. What is a fair interpretation? Is a non-interpretation which takes the passages as they stand without desire to make undue capital of them one way or the other. Well, a fair interpretation of these passages in this sense might prevent Paedo-Baptists from claiming them as demonstrative proof of infant baptism, and it would also certainly prevent anti-Paedo-Baptists from asserting that they have, quote, no reference to such a practice, end quote. It should lead both parties to agree that the passages have a possible but not a necessary reference to infant baptism, that they are neutral passages, in a word, which apparently imply infant baptism, by which may be explained without involving that implication if we otherwise know that infant baptism did not exist in that day. Fairly viewed, in other words, they are passages which will support any other indications of infant baptism which may be brought forward, but which will scarcely suffice to prove it against evidence to the contrary, or to do more than raise a presumption in its favor to the absence of other evidence for it. For what are these passages? The important ones are Acts 16:15, which declares that Lydia was baptized and her household, and Acts 16:33, which declares that the jailer was baptized and all his, together with 1 Corinthians 1:16, and I baptize also the household of Stephanas. Certainly, at first blush, we would think that the repeated baptism of households without further description would imply the baptism of the infants connected with them. It may be a fair response to this that we do not know that there were any infants in these households. True enough, but not sufficient to remove the suspicion that there may have been. It may still be fairer, quote, replied to say that whether the infants of these families, if there were infants in them, were baptized or not would depend on the practice of the apostles, and whatever that practice was would be readily understood by the first readers of Acts. But this would only amount to asking that infant baptism should not be founded solely on these passages alone, and this we have already granted. Neither of these lines of argument are adduced by Dr. Strong. They would not justify his position, which is not that the baptism of infants cannot be proved by these passages, but much more than his, that a fair interpretation of them definitely excludes all reference to it by them. Let us see what Dr. Strong means by a fair interpretation.